خير. مرحبا بكم جميعا وشكرا لانضمامكم إلينا في هذه الجلسة الرقمية التي تنظمها أريج اليوم بعنوان مقدمة في العدالة الانتقالية. يسعدنا أن نكون معكم اليوم لنقاش هذا الموضوع رغم كل الظروف الصعبة التي تحيط بعالمنا العربي وبدولنا العربية، من فلسطين إلى سوريا إلى لبنان إلى العراق إلى اليمن والسودان وغيرها من الدول العربية المتألمة والموجوعة. لكن نحن سعداء لوجودنا معكم اليوم لنقاش هذا الموضوع المهم بالتأكيد، وندير هذا الحوار مع ضيف له باع طويل في تغطية قضايا العدالة والمحاسبة في العالم. ربما قد يبدو مصطلح العدالة الانتقالية مبهما أو معقدا حين نتحدث عنه، وقد يبدو بعيدا ربما عن عالمنا العربي، ولكن في ظل الأزمات السياسية المعقدة التي تعيشها المنطقة العربية، في جوهر هذا المصطلح ليس أكثر من محاولة لفهم ماضي هذه الدول بكل ما فيه من آلام وتعقيدات، والعمل على شفاء الجراح، وهو بالضبط ما تحاول المجتمعات فعله عندما تنتقل من أزمنة ظالمة إلى مستقبل أكثر عدلا، سواء كان ذلك ظلما من الحكومات في تلك الدول أو ظلما من محتل أو مستعمر. هذه الجلسة الرقمية التي نعقدها اليوم ومدتها 90 دقيقة، ساعة ونصف من الآن، تسلط الضوء على آليات العدالة التي تندرج ضمن مفهوم العدالة الانتقالية، بما فيها العدالة الجنائية، كشف الحقيقة، التعويضات، التحقق، إحياء الذكرى والمصالحة، ونناقش أيضا فيها التجارب المطبقة في مختلف أنحاء العالم. طبعا كما العادة تتوفر الترجمة الفورية إلى العربية والإنجليزية، ويمكنكم اختيار اللغة المناسبة لكم من خلال اختيار أيقونة الكرة الأرضية أو الجلوب أسفل الشاشة، ثم اختيار اللغة. إذا كنتم تودون الاستماع باللغة العربية فقط اختاروا العربية، وكذلك الإنجليزية فقط اختاروا الإنجليزية، وابقوا على نفس اللغة طوال فترة هذه الجلسة. وبالتأكيد يمكنكم طرح أسئلتكم في أي وقت عبر خانة Q&A فقط الموجودة أسفل الشاشة، وسنحاول الإجابة عن أكبر عدد ممكن في أثناء الجلسة وفي نهايتها أيضاً. بالعودة إلى موضوعنا، ولمساعدتنا على فهم العدالة الانتقالية وربطه بما يجري في البلدان العربية ومنها سوريا أيضا، فضلا عن تسليط الضوء على التجارب الدولية في هذا المجال والتركيز على دور الصحافة والصحفيين فيه، يسعدنا أن نستضيف الصحفي تييري كروفولييه، رئيس تحرير جاستس إنفو، المتخصص في تتبع وتحليل مسارات العدالة الانتقالية ومبادرات العدالة في البلدان التي تتعامل مع العنف الخطير. أهلا وسهلا بك تيغي.
Thank you. Cut it cut off a little bit, but I guess you introduced me. So yes, nice to see you all, meet you all, even from a distance. I'm very happy to be with you tonight on this session. I have been a journalist all my life, so I think that with most of you are. So I'm one of your colleagues. I'm not, I'm not a big teacher from a big distance. That's not my point. I want to share with you what we need to know as reporters when it comes to this strange field of work that is called transitional justice. And so that's what I've been doing, yes, pretty much for the past almost 30 years, covering trials for war crimes and crimes against humanity, as well as truth commissions and all these sort of mechanisms, as we call them, that we will try to identify together tonight. Of course, if you have any urgent question, I'm completely flexible to be interrupted. And once in a while, I will also put your questions so that it makes our conversation a bit more lively and a bit more like a conversation as opposed to an expose. I think I'll start with a sort of classic definition of what is transitional justice. Basically, what we have called this is a range of judicial and non-judicial measures or mechanisms that are put in place after massive violence, after massive human rights violations in the context of a transition, usually from war to peace or from dictatorship to democracy. Of course, today, this idea of transition is a bit challenged because we actually use now some of these mechanisms in situations where we are not really in a transition. But in the case of Syria, it fits perfectly well with that traditional definition, so we can stick to that. The underlying principle is as follows. Victims have rights that are recognized in international law, and these rights are to see the perpetrators of the crimes punished, to know the truth of what happened and of the violence they suffered, and to receive reparations. Of course, in the field of transitional justice, we are dealing with crimes that are quite specific, and they are most of the time state crimes. But what they have in common, whether they are committed by the state or by other armed actors, for instance, is that they affect the society as a whole, and they have damaged the very foundations of a country, of a society. And the principle is to say that in order to restore social harmony and trust in state institutions, the state must demonstrate that it recognizes its responsibility, reforms itself, and offers guarantees that these crimes will not be repeated. And one of the ideas, of course, behind this is that if we ignore these crimes, they will lead to their repetition and the perpetuation of a state of lawlessness. Another big principle or idea behind this is that crimes are never forgotten. These kind of crimes are never forgotten, and the demand for justice does not disappear. You have plenty of examples these days of demands for justice that are about crimes that were committed a long time ago, sometimes even before the last generation that got to go through them has disappeared. I can just name one example that you must have heard about in many instances recently is crimes of slavery and colonial crimes. I'm talking about more like the European colonization are very much in the news these days, even though colonization has long ended in many ways, maybe not in all ways, but in many ways. And certainly all those responsible for it are long dead. So the idea is that the demand of justice doesn't go away, is part of what transitional justice means to address. You might also keep in mind that there are actually a number of countries that organize some form of justice, but some of them also decide to have none. And yet you can say that they managed to succeed in their transition from war to peace or from dictatorship to democracy. Two examples that have very often been cited are Spain. Spain ended the military dictatorship and transitioned to democracy without any effort to address the crimes committed under the dictatorship, and yet Spain is a strong democracy today. And in Africa, Mozambique was also often referred to when it comes to transferring from war to peace without any justice effort. It doesn't mean that it's going away. In Spain as well in Mozambique, the debate is still there, but they show that you can also manage a transition without any kind of justice, even though there are exceptions and even though they might prove at the end of the day, they might still need to go back to what was unresolved. So the specialists in the fields have identified a number of mechanisms to have sort of a clearer idea of what we're talking about. They made categories. Do you know, is there anyone who wants to, I think that Nadine referred to some of them, but what comes to mind to you that could be a mechanism in transitional justice? If anyone wants to jump in. Otherwise, I'll keep going, but feel free to say what comes to mind.
إذا ننتظر بعض
I
الإجابات
don't
على
know.
هذا السؤال من المشاركين معنا. إن كانت هناك أي آليات تعتقدون أنها من الممكن تطبيقها أو آليات لها علاقة بالعدالة الانتقالية، بإمكانكم مشاركتنا من خلال Q&A برأيكم بهذا الموضوع أو برأيكم بهاي الآليات تحديداً. إحنا عندنا مجموعة من الأسئلة تغينا،
Sorry, okay.
بإمكان أن نؤجلها قليلاً وأن نستكمل أيضاً الحديث.
Okay, because it's breaking up a bit on, yeah, okay. It's breaking up a bit on my end, so maybe I'll move on. We have about, let's put it simply with 5 pillars that help us identify what we're talking about. The first one is the most well-known, the most obvious. It's criminal prosecution, meaning trials. This has been a widespread option in many countries, as you know, but the strategy can vary greatly. You can decide, some countries decide to have a limited number of trials, very symbolic. In that case, they often attempt to target the alleged main perpetrators. This is the model that these international tribunals that you've heard about, including the International Criminal Court, the ICC, is following. It's a very limited number of individuals being tried. It has a highly symbolic value, and the objective is to try to have the most important leaders, leaders. So most countries decide to
نعم
limit the
تيري،
number of prosecution.
إن
Yes.
سمحت لي، هناك بعض الإجابات على السؤال اللي طرحته فيما يتعلق بآليات ومبادئ العدالة الانتقالية، إن أمكن أنه أشاركها من الجمهور اللي شاركونا فيها على ال
Oh,
Q&A.
so is it in the Q&R?
يس Q&A صحيح.
Oh yes, I
سأقرأ
see that.
الإجابات لأنها بالعربية وسنستعين بالترجمة لتصلك بعض الاقتراحات.
Okay.
أحمد بجلان يقول من هاي الآليات البحث عن الحقيقة. نبيلة إبراهيم علي تقول إجراء محاكمات عادلة، جبر الضرر والتعويض. ريم حداد تقترح أنه من آليات العدالة الانتقالية استكمال وثائق وأدلة للتوصل إلى العدالة والإحالة إلى المحكمة الجنائية الدولية مع مذكرة توقيف. الملاحقة القضائية واحدة من الآليات حسب ما يقول كريم الهادي. فأعتقد، وأيضا أحمد بجلان يقول تحقيق العدالة. ربى الحلو تقول truth seeking أو البحث عن الحقيقة والتصالح، وإضافة إلى إصلاح النظام القضائي أيضا.
Very good. So I see that you know already a lot. So maybe, yes, I think you've named almost them all, which is, and I'll go through them one by one, but you do have criminal prosecutions, trials, criminal justice. The second one is truth seeking. So it's a different kind of undertaking. The third one is what one of you has referred to, institution reforms. Fourth one is reparations. And the fifth one that we also consider as very much part of the justice effort is the memory work, is how you memorialize the crimes that were committed. So I'll go through these 5 main pillars. And as I was saying about trials, it's most of the time, it's a selected number of prosecutions that are chosen. The reason behind this is that the idea is that mass crimes comes with a massive number of perpetrators, and there are too many of them to try them all. And it's both considered as impossible to do so and also not desirable, because by doing so, you would divide the society further to the point of being destructive, which is not, of course, the aim of the justice process. That's really what we see everywhere. But you should also keep in mind that there is one big exception in that respect. It's Rwanda. As you know, in Rwanda in 1994, there was a genocide against the minority Tutsi population. And the Rwandan government decided that everyone should be accountable for whatever they did or benefit from the crime, not only murderers, not only those who committed sexual violence, but also those who stole from their dead neighbors, and so took some form of benefit from the crimes. And so Rwanda took exception and decided to organize trials before people's courts around the country. There were about 12,000 courts that were established in a sort of strange, original way, and that allowed them to try 1 million people in the space of about 10 years. So everybody at some point had to be accountable for it. And in that sense, Rwanda proved that, well, you can be creative, and if the political will is there, you can organize some form of mass justice. Now, keep in mind that all of this was not rosy. There were many instances of very unfair trials. It was complicated. It was tough for the whole population that was involved and had to be involved. It was pretty coerced as a process. And also that the crimes that were committed by the Tutsi rebellion, who won the war and put an end to the genocide, were never addressed. So it was only those who committed the genocide and were defeated in war who were tried. Okay, so keep it in mind, it's not an ideal example. It's just an example that challenges the idea that you can't do mass justice after mass violence. You can also have situations where you have a mixture of national justice efforts and international tribunals. Examples that come to mind is Rwanda. Rwanda had a UN tribunal that prosecuted a few dozens of top leaders of the former regime, while Rwanda was running their own national trials. In Bosnia, the same happened. There was a big UN tribunal for the former Yugoslavia outside the country, but the Bosnian justice system also undertook several hundreds trials on its own. So it's not one or the other. You have situations where there's only national justice, situations where there's only international justice, and some situations where you can have both. It still is the case today, for example, in the Congo and in the Central African Republic, where we have the ICC is involved, as well as national courts. And the counter examples, for instance, are Sierra Leone and Cambodia, where it was only an international court. There was no national effort whatsoever. The other point that I think is important to keep in mind for all of us and for you as well is how the possibility of having trials may change over time. In Latin America, for instance, which is where transitional justice was really, really initiated and created, I will get back to that. Their problem was the political transition from the dictatorship to a democratic regime. And at the time, the threat of the army was such that they could not go after the military leaders, and they had to agree on amnesty laws. And it's in exchange of these amnesty laws that they established truth commissions, which is what they could negotiate with the former uh, military regime. But 20 years later, when democracy was well rooted and solid in those countries, they canceled these amnesty laws and they went after the former leaders of their respective military regimes. So keep it in mind that justice opportunities change a lot over time. In my country, for instance, which is France, after World War II, there was a violent purge when the German occupation stopped. That took place it lasted almost a year, during which between 10,000 and 15,000 people were executed summarily after trials that were very, very unfair and expeditive, even though, I mean, of course, some of them were real perpetrators, but they had no chance to defend themselves. And then it stopped because the state said, that's it, it's over, and nothing else was done. And it took 40 years before France organized 3 major symbolic trials of important perpetrators during that time. Okay, so it's one example among so many where time is a very important factor in what you can be allowed to do, what the political context allows you to do. Okay, another thing, and that will introduce the second mechanism, is that in most of our countries, and that includes yours, I believe, we take criminal prosecutions as central to the justice demand. We believe in criminal justice. That's our system. But it's not the case everywhere. There are places in the world where some mass violence took place, but the society has different ways of recovering. And the idea of trying people, putting them in prison, is not part of the way the society works. And so they have their own, what we call traditional justice systems that are not criminal prosecutions, but that allow the society to stick together, to keep being one. So that leads me to the second one, which is the search for truth. Because a trial is essentially a legal battle between 2 opposing parties over specific facts, specific crimes that are defined by law, but it's not necessarily, and I think it's important for us reporters not to be confused about that. A trial is not necessarily or not entirely a search for the truth. There's a big difference between the judicial truth that comes out of a trial and the historical truth. And as a consequence, you have to also keep in mind that the kind of historical narrative that comes out of judgments of international courts, for instance, can be very problematic from a historical point of view. Lawyers are not necessarily the best qualified people to tell history. And so that's one of the limits of what criminal trials offer. In a way, their investigations provide information that is of great historical value, but some of this information will be dismissed by the different parties because they don't need them to prove their case. So that material would be great material for historians, but it won't be available to the public immediately. And that's in a way why, or what truth commissions of inquiry want to address. There've been many commissions of inquiry that have been set up throughout the world on all continents, in Asia, in in Europe, in Africa, in America, in many, including also in some Arabic countries like Morocco, like Tunisia. They've set up these commissions of inquiry that are not judicial. They are not punishing people, but their central objective is to establish the truth of the events, of the violence. The commissions I'm talking about are official commissions. They are sanctioned by the government, by the state. They have an official mandate given by the state. They are not investigations conducted by NGOs or by reporters on their own initiative. They are officially endorsed investigations. We have two models, one of which I am not going to spend time on. They're what we call really commissions of inquiry that have been set up in many places, especially by the UN. And then there are the truth commissions. And this is what I'm going to try to say a bit more about, because they are more relevant at this moment in time to Syria. I have honestly lost count of how many truth commissions there have been in the world. It's at least 80 of them. It's been, as I said, it's everywhere. The most recent ones that have been a main focus in the field are the one that took place in the Gambia at the end of the military dictatorship. That's a small country in West Africa. And the one that is still currently going on in Colombia, which was at the end of the war between a 50-year guerrilla group and government forces. But there have also been many of them, for instance, on colonial crimes in Canada, in Belgium, and currently still in Northern Europe, in Scandinavia, on indigenous people and what happened to them during their colonization. So there's an extraordinary variety of the way these commissions work. They're very flexible in the way you can design them. Every country has decided its own design. Some have strong powers of coercion. Others don't. Some have the power to amnesty perpetrators. Others don't. But others even have the power to bring cases to prosecution, to the criminal justice system. But others don't have that power. Most of them are national, but some of them can be mixed, like mostly national, but with some international on it. That's what happened in Sierra Leone, for instance, where the commissioners were Sierra Leoneans as well as internationals. And they can also have different names because sometimes politically, the word reconciliations, for instance, may not be acceptable. And so in some countries, it was out of question to call it a Truth and Reconciliation Commission, and they would call it something else. But they were essentially the same process. Most truth commissions have a mandate to look into a long history. They want to address the roots and causes of the conflict or of the dictatorship. So their mandate could cover several decades. That would be totally relevant to Syria, where the Assad regime took, last 50 years or so. So that would be a good example of the kind of mandates that the Truth Commission can embrace. Because the point is to, as I said, to understand the root causes of the violence. But their existence is supposed to be short. The average length for a Truth Commission is 2 years. And they're, of course, much less expensive than trials. What they always end up with is a report, a public report, and recommendations to the government on what to do next. And that is also maybe something you may want to know in advance to avoid big expectations that won't be met. A common weakness that I have seen with many of these truth commissions, including those that were very successful in their process, is the aftermath. That means the implementation of the recommendations that these truth commissions made are rarely fully addressed by the government. So the process can be very successful, the aftermath less so. What you want to keep in mind, as opposed to trials where the perpetrators is the central figure, victims of course are there, but the central character is the perpetrator. In a truth commission, it's the victims who are at the center of the whole process. So that is important to keep in mind. There is also something that I thought about while preparing this conversation with you, because I think Syria provides a pretty complicated, interesting case, because you do have to deal with two things at the same time. You have to deal with a civil war, a long civil war, as well as the end of a long dictatorship. You have, in a way, you have two transitions going on at the same time, a transition from dictatorship to potentially some form of pluralistic or democratic regime, as well as hopefully a transition from civil war to some decent level of peace. And what I wanted to share with you is that it appeared, we've had truth commissions dealing with civil war as well as with dictatorship, but originally they were made for the transition from dictatorship to democracy in Latin America, because they are very well suited to deal with with dictatorship crimes. The reason for it is that these crimes are often hidden by the state while they are committing it. It's very hard to know the truth during that time about the crimes committed. And so truth commissions are a well-designed mechanism to address these kind of crimes. Take an example that is so relevant to Syria: forced disappearance. You've had so many in Syria, and since the fall of Assad, it's been a major focus of the reporting that I have seen in the press. It's about trying to know what happened to those who disappeared in those many prisons. This is typically the kind of crime that the Truth Commission is considered today as very well suited to address. So I think that's a valuable thing to remember. Truth commissions are not necessarily so or are more limited in a way, or not greatly adapted to address the civil war. They are much better suited, I think, to address dictatorship crimes. It's not an absolute statement I'm saying. I can tell you, for instance, that the Truth Commission in Sierra Leone was pretty much only about the civil war, and it wasn't a great process, but the final report of the Truth Commission in Sierra Leone is, in my view, the best document ever written on the roots, the causes of the conflict, and the narrative, the whole history of the conflict. This report is a major addition to what we have to understand why it happened and how it happened. And that was a civil war. So I'm not saying that it's entirely useless, but I think it was just worth pointing this to you. The third pillar is these institutional reforms that one of you has identified. So it can be about, it's mostly about the law. The idea is that is to provide the country with better laws and institutions to protect it from further violations of individual rights. I'm not going to spend too much time on this, but there is one that I think is important to keep in mind that might be very relevant to Syria. It's what we call in English vetting. So that's going to be up to our great interpreters to find a translation for this English word. Is there anyone among you who knows what vetting is? Should I give you a chance to respond? Or is it completely foreign to you? You have no idea of what I'm talking about. Should I give Nadine a... Okay.
تيري، يعني واضح ما كنت قد تفضلت فيه، وعندنا مجموعة أيضا من الأسئلة. أنا بعرف أنه لسه الأركان أو الآليات وركائز العدالة الانتقالية لم تنتهي منها بعد، لكن دعنا نتطرق إلى بعض التعليقات والأسئلة اللي وصلتنا على Q&A، وبإمكانكم أيضا مشاركتنا المزيد. يعني هناك تأكيد على أهمية ما كنت قد تحدثت عنه، وهناك أيضا مجموعة من الأسئلة، وخاصة فيما يتعلق بالشأن السوري والسودان وفلسطين. يعني أولا نهال السوداء تقول إنه المغرب يعني قامت بتشكيل لجان الحقيقة، وقامت بأمر يعني كان ربما يعني كخطوة إضافية، وهي أن جعلت الضحايا أو عائلات الضحايا جزءا من هذه اللجان، ما كان أمرا ناجحا جدا. عمار رحموني عم بيشاركنا أيضا مجموعة من الآليات اللي تحدث عنها تييري، وسيتحدث أيضا عن مزيد منها. ولكن هناك أسئلة كثيرة فيما يتعلق بسوريا. يعني أنت تييري تطرقت إلى بعض الأمور وعكست بعض النماذج على سوريا، ولكن على سبيل المثال آمنة علو تسأل، تقول: أنا من سوريا، هل يمكن طرح أمثلة لكيفية تحقيق عدالة انتقالية بعد سقوط الأسد، خاصة أننا لا نريد المزيد من الدماء وأن تتحول الأمور إلى حالة من الانتقام الفردي؟ أيضا لدينا سؤال من رشا، وهو الجزئية الثانية التي سنتحدث عنها. تسأل رشا عن دور الصحافة في الكتابة عن العدالة الانتقالية، ما هو دور الصحفي وأبرز النقاط الحمراء الواجب تفاديها عند الكتابة عن هذه القضية. ونحن سنفرد جزئية كاملة رشا لهذه القضية بعد انتهاء تييري من هذا العرض. وأيضا كثير من الأسئلة فيما يتعلق بالسودان، بليبيا. يعني الأسئلة تقول إنه يعني ما فائدة العدالة الانتقالية إن كان الضحايا أصلا قد قتلوا وجيل كامل ربما قد فنى أيضا قبل تحصيل العدالة؟ وهذا الأمر أيضا ينطبق على غزة. هناك من يسأل أين هي العدالة الانتقالية مما يحدث في غزة. وأحمد بجلان يقول: في العراق هناك ملفات للآليات العدالة الانتقالية قبل وبعد عام 2003 ولم يتم تحقيقها. دعنا نبدأ تغيب بسوريا، لأن هناك الأسئلة كثيرة. كيف يمكن عكس الآليات التي تفضلت بها على الواقع السوري، ومحاولة أن لا يتم أخذ الحق باليد في سوريا نتيجة للغضب المتراكم، وأكيد يعني القتل المتراكم منذ أعوام طويلة؟
Thank you. I'm gonna have to disappoint you. If I knew what and how could it be done in Syria today, I think I would be very well known and I would be on TV every day in all the media, and I would be a star in Damascus. I don't. Of course I don't. It would be so presumptuous and so speculative for me to know how to do it in Syria. I don't. And I don't think that for us reporters, it is the point of knowing what to do. I think those who are going to decide are, of course, the political actors, and the role of the civil society is going to be, of course, very important. But reporters are going to be here to talk about this, to allow that debate to be widespread and shared in the most knowledgeable way, so that when we talk about prosecutions, just as I said, can we prosecute everyone? Well, if you know a little bit about what happened in other countries, it's important, it's interesting to say, well, many other countries have gone through this, and they decided that you couldn't go after everyone, for instance. And it's not to say this is what we should do or this is what we should not do. It's to help people having an informed opinion or understanding of what is feasible. It's also why I said it changes over time, because the political context everywhere allows things to be done at a particular point and not at some other point. And so that is also what I think journalists should know, because it helps them informing their readers in a more realistic way or with better knowledge of what other societies have done. It's not to tell them this is what we should do or this is what we must do or this is the way to do it, because we don't know better. If we knew any better, we wouldn't be journalists. We would want to be the political leaders of the country. That's not necessarily what a journalist wants to be or is here to be. So I'm sorry to disappoint, but I don't have solutions. And what I think is useful for all of us as reporters is to have as much knowledge and understanding of what we are talking about. So when the debate is being so urgently shared in Syria today about, so how are we addressing these crimes? You know a bit of what happened elsewhere and what other countries have tried, and what has been more or less successful, and what Syrians can decide on their own. At the end of the day, it's pretty clear to me that it's what a society decides that would be the best for them. Maybe that's part of the conversation in Syria, is how much do you want internationals to intervene or to be part of it? Do we want a tribunal that is international? Do we want a tribunal that is both national or international? It's completely up to Syrians to decide. But if you know that the limits, the great limitations of international tribunals, for instance, if you take the ICC usually try up to 5 people maximum for each situation. Do you think that is a reasonable answer to Syrians if they have only 5 leaders or top executives being tried? No, obviously not. And that's what it's going to be. The ICC wouldn't do more than that. I mean, the ICC doesn't have jurisdiction on Syria, as you know, so it's not an active question, but the answer that it would come from outside is usually accepting a very limited, very symbolic answer, and an answer that is probably not going to be owned by the population, because this will take place far away. And I'm not saying it's useless. I'm saying it's extremely limited. And so all this knowledge, I think, helps you to have a debate that is more knowledgeable, more reasonable, and better informed. But I don't know what Syria is going to choose. That's one of the questions that I wanted to ask you once we have gone through all the pillars. Is, so what do we have in Syria today, and what looks possible, or what looks like something that is too remote or not necessarily what Syrians seems to be wanting. But it's really entirely up to Syrians to know that. I cannot know, and it would be almost absurd for me to even say that I would know what is feasible and what is the best you can get for Syria today. I heard all the other questions, including the ones on Gaza. Of course, there is nothing for Gaza. And that's part of the problem in a way, is that there is no clear, it's not a time for transitional justice in Gaza. It's a time for destruction and war and occupation and expulsion, I mean, of people. So there are times where justice has no space at all. And that's the time for Gaza to some extent. But it's not entirely true, because there are cases that are brought on Gaza before these international tribunals. There's nothing that can be done nationally in Palestine and Israel today when it comes to justice on what's happening in Gaza. But as a result, because there is no option, that's typically a situation where it's helpful to have international institutions available, which is exactly what is happening with countries or prosecutors initiating cases on Gaza and on the responsibility of the Israeli leadership before the ICC, as you know, as well as before another court in The Hague, the International Court of Justice, which is a court that deals with disputes between states. As you know, Israel is being sued before the International Court of Justice by a number of countries led by South Africa for the genocide in Gaza. So it's not that there is nothing, but the only thing available today for Gaza is at the international level. There's nothing available at the national level. It's exactly the situation of Syria until December last year, where the only thing you would have for Syria were a few trials in Europe, as you know, and maybe we'll talk a little bit about it, and some legal action before the International Court of Justice, led by a number of countries that sued the Assad regime for their crimes. Okay? Is that good enough? Sorry, I'm going to be frustrating for many of you. Should I go back to vetting? Because I think
أكيد أكيد يعني بإمكانك العودة إلى الركائز تغي، ومن بعدها سنعود أيضا، لدينا كم كبير جدا من الأسئلة. لذلك يعني أعدكم أنه سنحاول الإجابة على كل الأسئلة، لكن بعد أن ينتهي تغي من ما بدأ به، وهي ركائز وآليات العدالة الانتقالية.
okay. So I'm going back to vetting because that's an issue for Syria. So what vetting in English is a very interesting word. We don't have it in French, which is why I ask interpreters, do you have in Arabic language a good word for vetting? In French, we don't. The one that comes to mind is purges. And purges, as you can hear, it sounds bloody. It sounds brutal. And in vetting, there is no bloodshed. The whole idea is to identify the state structures that were particularly involved in the crimes committed. That could be the army, that could be the police, that could be the judicial system, that could be the parliament. And the idea is to reform them, of course, so that they are not too tainted by the past. So in short, vetting is about removing individuals who are considered as the most involved in the repression, but without punishment, without judgment. It's just to remove them from the institution. And that has been something used in many countries. Are you still with me, or? Yes, I can see Nadine is alive. Like for instance, in Bosnia, several years after the end of the civil war, a third of the judiciary was replaced. So it was 8 years after the war. So they decided to just remove a third of judges and prosecutors who were considered as too involved in the conflict. When I was in Tunisia in 2012, so a year after the revolution, I remember colleagues, journalists, complaining precisely about the opposite situation, where the courts in Tunisia back then were still staffed with the same judges who had systematically convicted them under the Ben Ali regime. And so it was impossible for them to trust the judiciary if some of these people remained in place. Now, the whole challenge in every society has been to try to find the right balance between an effective vetting system and maintaining a functioning state. And from what I have read in the past few months on the situation in Syria, in your country, I have seen that at play very much. The government trying to find a balance between replacing the former regime administration and yet keeping the state together. Because you need state officials, functionaries, to run the state machine. It's not everyone who knows that. And so you cannot replace everyone, or it could be very risky to do so. So that is, I think, a key thing that Syria is going through and is going to go through, is to organize their own vetting system so that the worst elements are removed from the police, from the judiciary, from the parliament, and yet you keep the state functioning. Do you know what is the worst case that we all study in how you do vetting wrongly? How do you mess up with vetting? Do you know which case it is? It's very close to your country, so that's why I'm picking it, because it's something that you are familiar with. Anyone?
إذا كانت لديكم أي إجابات على هذا السؤال، مثال على تجربة تدقيق أو فحص سيئة. ويعني تييري أعطاكم هنت أو معلومة أنه في منطقة قريبة من دولنا العربية، ربما منطقة عاشت حربا، عاشت عدوانا، عاشت حربا أهلية. فبإمكانكم أن تجيبوا وأن تضعوا اقتراحاتكم في الكيو اند اي، وسأقوم أيضا بمشاركتها بشكل سريع مع تييري ومع الحضور أيضا. أوكي، عندنا محمد الجسم يقول العراق. هذا أول رأي من محمد، العراق. أيضا يعني هناك أسئلة كثيرة، ولكن سنعود إليها بعد أن ينتهي
But that's
تغيير.
correct.
إذن العراق هي التجربة المريرة التي سيتحدث عنها تغيير بالتفصيل الآن.
That is the correct answer. Again, we're not here to do the whole history of it, but just for you to keep that in mind. The Americans, when they invaded Iraq, I'm talking about, of course, the second time, the removal of Saddam regime, they decided that the entire Ba'ath administration would be removed. Anyone who's worked in that state administration would be removed. And what happened? The state collapsed. And so it was typically a wrong understanding of how you organize some vetting process in a situation that is still extremely sensitive, explosive, and violent. Okay, so it's just for you to keep in mind, because what I read from Syria is pretty much that. What I see is the authorities trying to find a way to keep the state functioning while of course, removing the main agents of the Assad regime. Okay, so vetting is part of transitional justice. It's part of the institutional reforms that you organize, and it's a key one, I think, in the case of Syria today. I have to move on. The fourth pillar is reparations. Of course, I think when you hear reparations, you understand immediately what it's about. And yet, when it comes to mass crimes, reparation is a pretty complicated issue to address and justice demand to address. In my mind, all victims want reparations. It's a key demand from victims everywhere I have been. And for instance, it's a demand that international tribunals have dismissed, have not addressed. They seem to be not concerned with that major central request by the victims. The problem is, what do you do with reparations when you have such mass level of violence? In many instances, like for instance, individual financial reparation is very often ruled out because it is considered as too expensive. And so the focus is much more on collective reparations, and they can take all kinds of forms. They can be the construction of schools and health centers as part of a reparations program, or free education to war orphans, for instance. There are many things you can do that are considered as collective reparations. The problem, and I'm not sure exactly what the Syrian government today's position is about. You may know, maybe they have made statements already that are clear about this, but the problem is that the crimes were committed by the state, and so it should be the state responsibility to repair. And in several situations, you have a state that is not willing to take responsibility for the previous regime. They say it's not us, it's them, and so we're not responsible for reparations. In other instances, the state that replaced, the government that replaced the one who committed crimes, took responsibility for the past, even though they, of course, were not the perpetrators. Two examples come to mind. Germany, after the World War II, took responsibility for the Hitler regime and paid reparations, sometimes for decades. Another one was South Africa, where you had an apartheid regime, as you know, that disappeared in the early 90s, and the new government that was led by Mandela. So, of course, the victims of the apartheid. Mandela said the state has continuity, and so the state has to repair what was done in its name. And so the ANC state that followed apartheid officially took responsibility to repair. Okay, so that's also key when it comes to the reparations conversation. Has the Syrian new government already said that it would take responsibility because there is a continuation of the state? Some other countries did not. Cambodia, for instance, never took responsibility for what happened under the Pol Pot regime. I don't know if you're all familiar, but that was a horrible 4-year regime where a third of the population in Cambodia was murdered. And the following government never took responsibility. They never said that they had responsibility to repair, and there was no reparation. Okay, so that's a key thing. Now, part of okay, so I have a question now because of what I said, which is there is this idea that if you're not a rich state, you cannot provide reparations. It's a very classic conversation that you would hear everywhere, and that I'm sure that it will be part of the Syrian conversation, is that, well, we have no money, we're poor, we're bankrupt, we cannot pay reparations to victims. Well, there is one country that has challenged this idea in a very interesting way, and that's Rwanda. Rwanda is a poor state, and when the genocide and the civil war ended in 1994, it was even poorer. The country was destroyed, several hundred thousands of people were killed. The whole society was broken, and the whole economy was broken. And yet, the new government decided that there had to be some form of reparation. And so they were creative, just the way they were creative in organizing trials for everyone. They were creative, and they created a fund for victims that everybody would have to pay for. So it was a very small tax, very small, that pretty much everybody could afford. I don't know what would be the equivalent but let's say it was $1, okay? But everybody had to give $1. And companies, NGOs, organizations would have to pay a bit more. So everyone working, living in Rwanda would have to participate to that national fund for victims. Well, that's creative because it's actually a very, very tiny amount of money that everybody could actually give. But if you multiply it by the number of inhabitants, you have millions. And so that's exactly what happened. And so Rwanda, which was a very poor country, managed to have a fund to build schools and health centers for orphans. They really focused on orphans in Rwanda, but at least they would have that fund to address the needs of these victims and to repair them, okay? So again, in my view, it's important to keep that in mind as a journalist, because if one day your state leaders say, well, we're too poor to provide reparations, you can always say, well, in Rwanda, they decided to create that fund. What about that? Just saying. That's why it's good to know, because you have better questions to ask, or you don't take for granted ideas that seem obvious, because everybody seems to understand that. Everybody seems to say, yes, we are too poor. Well, no, not necessarily. It's all about, at some point, it's all about political will and creativity. Okay? So that's a good one, I think, to keep that in mind. I see the time running, so I'm trying to move forward to the fifth pillar, which is the preservation of memory. Of course, you know that, I think, already. There are already efforts underway in Syria to keep the memory of the crimes, to think about memorials, to think perhaps even later about museums. And so many societies have tried to organize this. It is part of transitional justice. It's part of the idea that to keep the memory of what happened is part of the response to the victims of the crimes. Of course, what is mostly known are museums, memorials, but there could be other very symbolic measures. And if you go deeper into the world of memory work, it's also incredibly creative. Artists come into the picture and participate and contribute to that memory. Let me just give you some examples that are very striking. If you ever go one day to Sarajevo, which is the capital city of Bosnia, still today, which is 30 years after the war, you can walk on the pavement and you're going to see some colors on the ground, and this is where a shell fell and killed civilians, people who lived in Sarajevo. And so they kept the traces of the shell and they painted them. And they kept this as a memory work. And it's extremely striking when you walk over it, you stop. You remember, you have at least, a few seconds where you can say, hey, 30 years ago, some civilians died here. There's no plague, there's no other words, there's no names, but it's about, hey, this is what happened. If you go to Germany, in all cities in Germany, there are these cobblestones on the pavement at the foot of a building. And on it, there's the name of a former German Jewish resident who used to live there when the Nazi came. And on that cobblestone, there's the name and the death camp where they died. And it's very small. It's discreet. If you don't pay too much attention, you don't really see it. But gradually, you're going to walk on one of them, and then you remember that some Jewish people lived there before they were sent to extermination. It's a very creative, powerful way to also keep the memory for the German society. Okay, so, and do you have as many creative options as there are countries? And I'm sure that Syrians are gonna be as creative as others and imagine ways to remember that way. By the way, it made me think that when it comes to museums and memorials, like in Cambodia, the main prison that was the symbol of the Pol Pot terror regime is today the museum for on the genocide. If you go to Argentina, the main prison during the military dictatorship is today a museum to remember the crimes of the dictatorship. While I don't know what the state is going, the civil society is going to ask for the use of the famous Saidnaya prison in Damascus, but that would typically be a place that could be discussed to become a museum or to become a permanent memorial of the crimes of the Assad regime. Maybe just a little word before we open it to some questions. I know Nadine is going to be mad because we've just covered transitional justice as opposed to the role of journalists, but we'll see what we can do. And again, I can always come back to you. But basically, the idea that there is no single magic recipe when it comes to giving a response to the victims after such mass violence. Ideally, of course, you want to have it all. You want to have some trials, some truth-seeking, some reparations, institution reforms, and memory work. That's the ideal world. But in many countries, it appeared that it would be only possible to have some of it, or some of it at a particular time. Perhaps the only exception I have in mind where a country decided to have it all is Colombia today. Colombia decided to have the entire spectrum of transitional justice being implemented. They have every mechanism has been put in place at the same time. It's a fascinating case to study, but it's also a particular situation where the war ended through a negotiated peace. And that might be something to keep in mind also, is how justice varies greatly, whether it comes from a negotiated peace or not. And so in the case of Syria, it is not. It's the fall of a regime. There is one, there is one regime that is defeated. And so that opens up options for justice that are not necessarily open when it's a negotiated peace. As a contrary, if you have a negotiated peace, it also allows the society things that that a society where the full victory of one side does not allow. So the point is not for me, we don't choose that.
نعم.
You didn't choose what your situation is. What the point that is very important to remember, in my view, is that it matters. It has a direct impact on the justice options that a society takes, whether it comes from a negotiated settlement or not. And in Colombia, it was. And so that probably explains why they also had the possibility to have the entire spectrum in their own way. Every one of their mechanism was very original too. Okay, but that's the idea. Now, how does it look like in Syria today when we know all these background information? What I see is that you do have national and international dimensions in Syria. As you know, we've had and we probably will still have some trials under what we call universal jurisdiction, which is a law that allows a state to prosecute a non-citizen for crimes that have been committed outside the country. I'm sure that all of you have heard about the trials, especially taking place in Germany, but there are others in Sweden, in the Netherlands, of former Syrian agents who took refuge in those countries and who are arrested and prosecuted in those countries. We will still have some of these, for sure. I think there is one in France taking place very soon. We have, as you know, 2 UN mechanisms for the collection of evidence, which is unique. I don't know this situation. So like, how is it going to work between these 2 UN institutions that are based in Geneva, whose mandate was to collect the evidence when the Assad regime was still in place? How these institutions are going to work with the new national institutions, which are of course willing now to collect the evidence. This is a big debate for me, and I don't know what is going to be the answer because we don't have any experience in that respect. But it's going to be very interesting to see how it plays out. There are some talks I heard about a
نعم
hybrid court to have a, well, sorry. Go ahead, Nadine.
تري آسفة على المقاطعة، ولكن يعني كم الأسئلة كبير جدا صراحة. عندنا تقريبا 70 سؤال بانتظار الإجابة. أنا حاولت أجمع ما يتماشى مع نفس السياق مع بعضه، وهناك أسئلة كثيرة عن الأمثلة اللي طرحتها حضرتك تيري، وكيف يمكن عكس هذه الأمثلة على السودان، على سوريا، على فلسطين، على اليمن. يعني معظم الحضور يسألون عن من يبدأ آليات العدالة الانتقالية وكيف يمكن الاستفادة من تجارب هذه الدول. وإن أردت الإجابة عن هذا السؤال بشكل سريع، ومن بعدها أيضا هناك سؤال من الدكتورة ربا حول أساليب ضمان عدم تضارب عملية التدقيق أو التحقق وانتقائيتها. فدعنا في البداية نجيب عن من يبدأ عملية العدالة الانتقالية وكيف يمكن عكس نماذج الدول الأخرى على الدول التي تعاني من الصراعات والحروب والويلات حاليا. ودعنا نحاول أن نختصر لأنه لدينا بس 13 دقيقة.
Okay, it's a very good point. It seems to me that wherever some transitional justice is being actively implemented, it is the result of the will of the political leadership. You cannot achieve anything without the political leadership being willing to address this issue. But it's not enough, because if the political leadership is alone deciding, it will decide a model or a process that suits their only interest. And so that's where the civil society, you know, you understand what I mean. That's where the role of the civil society has been so key in shaping the kind of transitional justice you will have. If you have a strong civil society that is actively demanding specific mechanisms of justice and being involved, then you're going to have a better response, obviously, with better results. Of course,
نعم.
depending on the mechanism, the role of the society is different. For a truth commission, the role of the society is key. It's central because they're going to be part of it. They're going to be part of the process. For criminal trials, it's essential in the sense that it's going to push for it. But it still is going to be the judiciary that is going to be in charge. It's not for the population to decide who you prosecute or not. Not in a regime that applies the law. But yeah, I think the best answer, even though it sounds very simple, it is necessarily a combination of political will and strong civil society push, pressure.
نعم. نعم، إذن يعني العدالة الانتقالية مسؤولية تشاركية، يعني بحاجة إلى إرادة سياسية، ولكنها في نفس الوقت بحاجة إلى عمل مدني من المؤسسات المجتمع المدني. ومن هنا أيضا يعني ربما نحتاج الحديث عن دور الصحافة تغي. يعني هناك أسئلة كثيرة عن دورنا كصحفيين، نرى بلداننا مهشمة متألمة، نرى ضحايا أمام أعيننا ونعايش قصصهم يوميا، ونشعر بأن هناك واجب بإمكاننا القيام فيه لتحقيق العدالة، سواء الانتقالية أو حتى العدالة لكل ضحايا هذه المرحلة. فيعني مسؤولية الصحفي هنا سؤال، هو مسؤولية كفرد أم مسؤولية مجتمعية والصحفي هو جزء منها يجب أن يقوم بدوره؟
Yeah, it's always the role of journalist, I think, can be very different depending on what stage you are in that transitional justice process. If it's before any justice institution is implemented, the role of journalist is obviously first investigative, which is to investigate the crimes and document them. And the media is where the conversation, the debate is going to happen. So if the media does not create a forum of discussion on these justice issues for pretty much also for the civil society to push their agenda, it is not going to help. And so the media, I think, as a forum for debate and for informed debate, which is, I insist on that. I think that, of course, we allow people to talk in our media platforms and to express ideas and plans and to advocate for justice. But our main role is to allow the conversation, and is also to provide our readers or listeners with an informed knowledge of what we are talking about. There will always be disappointment after mass violence when it comes to justice. Always. I have never known a situation where everybody was happy with what was achieved, even in situations where a lot was achieved. It is impossible to meet the expectations of victims after such mass violence. There will be frustration, there will be disappointment anywhere. And so the media is also here to, in my view, to help understand that and explain it in advance. Like, don't dream of the ICC. Don't say no to it, but don't dream of it. Don't dream of even of a national prosecution system that is going to fulfill all the expectations of victims. No, it is much more. It is always difficult. It is always unsatisfactory at the end of the day because the violence was such that you can't repair. How do you repair when people have been murdered and disappeared? You cannot replace them. Even if you have the best reparations program, it's not going to bring back the dead. And so there's always a point where, in my view, the media has a role to make people aware that it has to be done, but it will be unsatisfactory because there is no way we can give a full answer to victims of such crimes. So in that sense, I think there is a sort of pedagogical dimension in our work, which is and it is by informing people. It's by telling them that many other countries have gone through these questions and they tried to get the best answers, and some of them got pretty good answers, but never to the point that at least part of the victim community would not be satisfied. Remember also that when we talk about victims, there are those we hear because they are engaged, they are organized, and they have a voice. And they're all the other victims who don't speak, who will never speak. And they're still victims, but somehow they are dealing with their suffering differently and in silence. And so who am I to know what they feel and what they understood of the process when they decided that they can't even talk about it? And we must never forget that part of the community of victims, because it's not because they are silent that they are not victims. And so when we talk about victims, I'm always very careful. There are so many, and they deal very differently with their suffering. And all their ways of dealing with it are legitimate. Of course, we need those who are engaged and committed and advocating for their rights, because otherwise they're not going to have any. But
نعم.
it's not a full response. I don't
نعم.
know if it's not very complete, but it's a few ideas in a few minutes.
أكيد. تغي، يعني لدينا 5 دقائق أو 4 دقائق متبقية من الوقت. يعني هناك سؤال مهم عن عملية التدقيق، الفيتنج يعني أخذت حيز كبير من النقاش بالأسئلة وحتى في الاختلاف على تعريفها. وهناك سؤال مهم إنه ما هي الأساليب أو الآليات التي يمكن أن نضمن من خلالها عدم تضارب عملية التدقيق والتحقق وانتقائيتها. وأتوقع أن لديك 3 قواعد ذهبية تود مشاركتها قبل ختام هذه الجلسة مع المشاركين، حتى تكون يعني بمثابة التذكير الدائم لنا كصحفيين عندما نعمل على مثل هذا النوع من القضايا.
Oh, okay. Thank you, Nadine. Well, the three golden rules that Nadine is referring to is essentially rules that we apply as reporters when we are covering processes, be they trials in particular, which is what CIA, I think, will have at some point. And it also is valid for truth commissions as well. You know, the rules of journalism don't change. It's the same ethics that we apply when we cover justice, just like when we cover other stuff. But it's true that there are 3 rules that we have identified when covering justice that are key, crucial. We call them the golden rules. First is accuracy. That means that all parties in a justice process should expect from us that their arguments are going to be fairly reported. And that means when you cover a court or when you cover a truth commission, your note taking is going to be so important, especially when recording is not allowed, which is the case in some situations. Maybe it will be allowed in Syria. And so you have to give every party their share, their argument. And if you miss something, what we do when I'm covering a trial and there's something I didn't fully understand at the trial, I'm going to go back to the parties and ask them to clarify it. And when they clarify it, I try to cross-check with the opposing party, so I'm pretty sure that what I didn't understand is clear. So accuracy is one. Two is balance. I think I referred to that in my talk, but we do have to sometimes put information that help understanding the position of the party, but also when a trial is long, and these trials can be long, especially when they're before international tribunals, but war crimes trials can be long, we have to organize a balance between the parties in our reporting. But that is not necessarily for each article to be equally balanced. If the trial is long, it's the balance over our whole reporting. We must be aware of that. We must constantly make sure that we provide that kind of balance. And it's very hard to do that when the trials are in your country, committed by your own people, because you are going to come with your own experience of the violence and with your own suffering and grievance. So it's going to be far more important for you as a Syrian journalist to cover it and to apply these rules. It's going to be, to me, it's going to be a daily reminder for you, like, this is my job. I have to provide accuracy, balance, and clarity, which is the third one. But I want to say a couple of things about this balance, meaning in your position, you're going to have to be careful of antipathy or compassion towards the accused, depending on your own sensitivity, your own personal sensitivity. You're going to have to constantly keep that in check in order to do your work as a fair, honest reporter. There are other things that help being balanced, for instance, is that if you cover a trial, we have a tendency to see the accused in an ugly way because we believe that is a great perpetrator. And so we use, for instance, a lot of physical description or easy interpretation of their face, etc. These are things that we try to avoid and be very careful about because they affect our balance, because it's a bias. You don't know the reason for someone's reaction in court. When someone is tried, it's a very specific
نعم.
environment. Okay, and clarity is we need to understand the technicalities of law, for instance. You can't cover a trial properly if you don't understand a bit the law. And this is to be able to explain it to your readers in the most simple way and yet being accurate. So we need to learn, we need to do our homework to learn the legal jargon in order to make it understandable. Again, it's a short answer to a long debate.
أكيد أكيد، يعني كنا نتوقع أن 90 دقيقة أنا وأنت تغي ستكون ربما كافية لتغطية بعض الجوانب، لكن ربما نحن بحاجة مزيد من الوقت أيضا لتغطية كل الجوانب الحساسة التي نتحدث عنها اليوم. ولكن قبل الختام شاركتني العزيزة روان اليوم مقال جدا رائع وجدا مهم، وخاصة للمهتمين بالعدالة الانتقالية في سوريا. العدالة الانتقالية، العنوان كان العدالة الانتقالية حجر أساس وضرورة وطنية هل تتعلم سوريا من التاريخ أسئلة كثيرة يعود فيها إلى خط زمني في سوريا، وأتخيل أن هناك مجموعة من القضايا التي يمكن تسليط الضوء عليها والتعلم منها أيضا، وحتى ذكرها في بعض التقارير التي قد يقوم بإعدادها الزملاء. سنقوم بمشاركتكم رابط هذا المقال من خلال الشات. زميلي سعيد سيضع لكم، وأنصحكم بقراءته خاصة للمهتمين بالشأن السوري وبقضايا العدالة الانتقالية. يعني بهذا نكون وصلنا إلى ختام جلسة اليوم. كانت بالفعل جلسة قيمة جدا لي على المستوى الشخصي، وأتمنى أن تكون أيضا مفيدة لكل الحاضرين. أعتذر جدا من كل من لم أستطع أن أشارك بسؤال، وحاولت جمع مجموعة من الأسئلة معا حتى نتمكن من الإجابة عن كل الأسئلة. وصلنا قرابة 120 سؤال، وكان من الصعب الإجابة عليها كلها في هذا الوقت. لكن تييري كروفولييه، أشكرك جدا لوجودك معنا اليوم. كانت فعلا يعني هي ليست محاضرة، وإنما جلسة تفاعلية شيقة وممتعة، ووضعت مجموعة من الأسئلة والإجابات أيضا في أذهاننا كصحفيين وممارسين أيضا. نشكرك جدا لوجودك معنا.
Thank you, Nadine. Thank you, everyone. I hope it's not going to be too frustrating for you guys because we are distant and we have so little time. But I'll be happy to be back if need be or to continue the conversation. And thank you very much, Rawan and Nadine, for organizing this. It was a pleasure. And good luck to everyone in your work and in your respective difficult situations.
شكرا جزيلا، وأنا أشكر أيضا طاقم الترجمة معنا. أشكركم جزيلا لجهودكم معنا بهاي الساعة ونص، ونشكر كل من حضروا وأسهموا في جعل هذا اللقاء مثمرا وبالفعل مفيدا لنا جميعا. كما أشكر صديقي وزميلي سعيد حماد من فريق الدعم التقني. شكرا جزيلا لكم، ونتمنى لكم مساء سعيدا. إلى اللقاء.
Thank you.